Now, what makes them those pretty colors is that stony corals that require light because in their little polyp body, they have living with them to help them algae. The algae is described on the top of page 339, and it's called zooxanthellae. I'm going to get it. Zooxanthellae. There you go. Zooxanthellae. It's not a word I use very much, so please forgive me. And that is the coral that lives, the algae that lives inside the coral. Now, one of the books I read, it's like over a third of the polyp is the algae. So we're talking about here, these two really live together and help one another. And this particular algae, what this algae does for the coral is that the algae actually produces sugar through photosynthesis and provides 90% of the sugar that the good kind of sugar, not Snickers bars, okay, glucose that the cells need to do energy purposes. Think apples and carrots and oranges, you know, good for you sugars, okay? So the algae makes the sugars, and it also provides, through the process of photosynthesis, oxygen for the coral. The little coral animal provides carbon dioxide for the algae, because the algae needs that to photosynthesize, and the coral's wastes, believe it or not, are actually used by the algae. So these two are living together, recycling each other's wastes, basically, and helping each other to live. And the algae actually can help make the calcium carbonate and the proteins that the coral uses to make the rocks. Go figure. And that's where the pretty colors come from. I had a guy in one of those saltwater fish tank stores. He had the weirdest colored corals in his tanks, and I said, how do you get them all those weird colors? He goes, it depends on the algae you put in them and what color light you put on them. And so the algae actually have a lot to do with all those pretty colors. Now the trick is this, and this is very, very important. Corals live in nutrient-poor water. Corals live in nutrient-poor water. If the water becomes full of nutrients, fertilizer, debris from dead things, you know, that have been alive that are now dead. The exact things that the grass likes, the exact things that the other things like the oysters and the mussels that made reefs, they love that sediment-filled water, don't they? They're busy cleaning it out because they want all those nutrients so that they can build their shells and they can survive. The exact opposite is true of corals. Corals need nutrient-poor water. Now get this, because I thought this was very interesting. Two reasons. Number one, that's part of the reason they're so pretty, because where the corals are, the water is clear, usually, because the corals need it nutrient poor, so you don't see anything. They also need the water to be clear so the sunlight can hit the algae, so the algae can be happy, so everybody can live. Because if the algae dies, the coral dies. It's just that simple. Okay, they are totally symbiotic. They need each other. Algae dies, coral dies, if it's that kind of algae. Trick is this: if we get too much nutrients in the water, then what happens is the competing algae, the ones you don't want there, overrun the corals and kill the corals off, because the other competitors can live there and it tends to kill the corals off. Now, corals themselves are predators. They'll eat other corals. They'll actually, and if you get on the reef, you'll see where one coral is eating another coral, and it's going right over the top of them. So it actually calls them predators here, and they are predators. And remember, they're busy predatoring, you know, preying on the phytoplankton and stuff too. But they are very sensitive to changes. Any change that kills the algae, they die. Any change that allows their competitors to live, like nutrients in the water, they die. So immediately we should be concerned because of what we've already learned about, remember when we studied the Everglades, and that the way we've cut these canals in the state to bring it down to the Lake Okeechobee and then to gather the water and keep it from flooding down here, we already learned about how there's no longer the wetlands that we need and the plants that we need to absorb all those nutrients, and that's why we have all this problem with all these nutrients. That water runs right off the end of Florida Bay, and it affects the coral reefs. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. On page 341, the top of it, it showed us, that picture shows us that the barrier reefs that we have along Florida, I didn't know Florida had barrier reefs. I just never heard it called a barrier reef. But if you do some little extra research, our barrier reef around Florida is the third largest in the world. I had no idea. I knew it was great. I knew it was pretty. I love Florida. I love that the Lord blessed me with this, but I had no idea. And the biggest reefs, it tells us in that picture, are outside of the longest biggest keys, and that makes sense because the water in Florida Bay is a little too cold for them, and so it actually slows down that cold water until it can warm up, and then it doesn't kill the corals because the corals need the nice warm water. And that's why the biggest reefs are along the biggest keys. And then it went bing. That's why we see Penny Camp outside of Key Largo. Look at Key Largo. It's that first key off the mainland. Look how big it is. And that's where Penny Camp is. Well, duh. So all of a sudden that made sense to me. And so as we look at these, let's flip over to page 342 for just a minute. God bless you. The top picture shows you a bank reef. These bank reefs are basically what make up the barrier reef, the coral reef that we see that we were just talking about. The bank reefs are about 300 feet long. It says that the top of them can be as shallow as 3 feet, like I told you about Grecian rocks. The seaward side, which is on the right-hand side of that top picture, has there's zones in the reef, and they have particular corals that live in those areas. That particular kind of formation reminds me of a reef called Hens and Chickens. And Hens and Chickens is out off of Key Largo, and it's got these real interesting things that come straight up and down on the seaward side that look just like that. I saw one of the prettiest leopard rays I've ever seen on that particular reef. And then as you go up on the top of the reef, you have more of the elkhorn coral and places like that. And then on the land side, you have more of the rubble and the dead corals as it's growing out the other direction usually, I guess. But those are the zones, and they are determined, just like we saw the different types of trees grew because of different elevations in the Everglades. Same thing going on with the reef. It's the different elevations actually affect the different things that live on the reef. That's cool, right? Same kind of thing going on there. On the bottom you see a patch reef. And a patch reef is actually just like a little reef that's surrounded by grass, and right around the outside, before the grass and before the reef, right around the outside edge of the reef, is a sand area. And I thought this was so cool. It told us why the sand area is there. It said that that's how far out the fish feel safe eating, and then they have to come back in. And so they make this little ring from the different animals that eat the grass. They go out, they eat the grass, and then they come back in. So that's the little area they've eaten away. Pretty neat, huh? And these reefs only usually, it says, about 6 feet high, and they can... I've actually, when I was reading this, I thought, oh my goodness, that's that one big rock I saw once. I have literally, in about 15 feet of water, saw one reef that literally kind of went straight up like this, and it looked like a big round, it might have been one piece of coral that everything else had decided to grow on, and it just looked like this big ball. The top of it was only about 4 feet under the water, which I can imagine that would have been dangerous for boats. And then it had all these sea fans on it and all this other stuff, and it was so cool because it was like this big ball. And I thought, well, that's not a patch reef, because patch reefs, it actually said they're hollow on the inside. Remember? Talked about them being hollow on the inside because the corals have grown over them this way, and it says that there's time sharing going on inside of the hole, because in the daytime certain animals live there and then they sleep at night. No, the daytime animals are nocturnal, so they're sleeping in there in the daytime, they go out and feed at night, and when they're out, then the daytime animals go in and they sleep. And so it's very cool because they're protected inside of there. And then you see on page 343 some of the very pretty fish. And the fish on the reefs are beautiful and extremely colorful. I'm going fast because I want to show you a couple video clips that I put together for you. There are species of animals that live on eating the corals. If you're ever on the reef, and I don't have one of these on the videos, so I just want to tell you, if you're ever on the reef, there's this beautiful set of fish called parrotfish, besides all the pretty angelfish and everything. The parrotfish have a parrot-like bill, and that's why they're called the parrotfish. They eat corals, and you can literally hear them while you're in the water. You can hear them hitting the coral. Bap, bap, as they eat the coral. And you can see some parrotfish this long, and they're yellow and teal and purple. And then there's another group of parrotfish that are black with these really pretty turquoisey, tealy colors all over them. Really pretty. And I think that's partly why they're called parrotfish also. So there's other fish, though. The butterfly fish, the spadefish, the damselfish, they also eat the corals. On the right-hand page, on page 345, we see the Caribbean spiny lobsters, and they live a bunch of places apparently. It says here that they live out on the deeper reef, and then they spawn off the reefs in the deeper water. Then they come back into the shallower coral reefs, and when they're moving back and forth in between, they do this little marching thing, because the last guy is the vulnerable guy, because their back end is what's vulnerable. The front of them, they've got all those little spikes on them, so they can kind of protect themselves, because they'll try to stick whoever's trying to eat them in the eye. I watched this on one video where a turtle was trying to eat him, and the lobster's going like this, like, I'm going to poke you in the eye. And eventually the turtle gave it up. It was like, oh, never mind, you know. So that's why in these little marches, it's the guy on the back end that's in trouble because he's got his back end out, and that's the vulnerable part. And that's why they march like this, is so that at least protects everybody else, that back guy. It's kind of like the first penguin that gets pushed in, if you've ever seen those movies, but we won't go there. Anyway, and then it talked about that they have a very sophisticated way of navigating with the magnetic field of the Earth. So they have built-in compasses, and I love to hear an evolutionist say that. I want to throw you one more about these silly little lobster critters. Their eye is so specifically designed for catching light in a very strange way, the way God designed them, that now they actually have designed telescopes in satellites to find distant galaxies that make X-rays instead of visible radiation that we can see, just to find those galaxies, and they use the design in the lobster's eye to design those telescopes around. And that just happened, right? I don't think so. Anyway, and so the mangrove swamps are nurseries for the young fish. The swamps and the seagrasses are food for the young fish, and they also provide cover for the critters. The coral reefs actually protect all of these other environments because they keep storm surges from coming in as hard as they would, and they also stop the storm surge erosion that would occur otherwise. And they also provide a sanctuary for a lot of fish and other animals. And then the coral reefs are an indicator. I wouldn't say species because they're actually made up of a bunch of species, but they're an indicator, like an indicator species. If the coral reefs are in trouble, we know something's wrong, and we need to go up the line and figure out what's wrong and try to fix it. And so we can look at it as a major group of indicator species. Why don't we call it an indicator ecosystem? Okay, the coral reefs are an indicator ecosystem. Now I'm going to show you a video on very briefly on pennycamp. The other one is actually the last portion of a video that was on the Everglades, but because of what's happened to the Everglades, we're destroying our coral reefs, and there are people trying to fix it, so I want you to see that. So I'm going to go ahead and do those, and then we'll wrap up.
Jill and Tom sail across Florida Bay to swim in the estuaries near the Florida Keys. Within the mangrove fringe are many tidal cuts and islands teeming with life.
30 or 40 years ago, I used to come down here to Florida Bay to fish and snorkel. But I've noticed now that things have changed. There are a lot more saltwater-loving organisms here than there used to be.
Many organisms thrive in narrow margins of salinity. When unsuitable salinity causes seagrasses to die, their decomposing remains can cause a chain reaction resulting in algae blooms and poor water quality.
The fresh water that used to flow into the bay from the Everglades has been diminished and altered, both the amount and the timing. What goes on in Florida Bay is going to affect the health of the reef tract. It's the only coral reef in North America, and we've got to take care of the bay to take care of the reef.
Stormwater runoff carried to the sea by Florida's network of man-made canals adds to the stress on coastal wetlands. One of the principal goals of Everglades restoration focuses on undoing damage caused by the Central and South Florida flood control canals. It's all about getting the right amount of water at the right time in the right place. Projects like backfilling major canals are already underway. By keeping stormwater where it belongs, the health of estuary environments in Florida Bay will be greatly improved. Mangroves serve as the last line of defense for the marine environment.
For me, this was such an amazing day. I know not all areas of Florida Bay are this healthy, but here among the mangrove roots were tiny fish and crustaceans, and all the little babies that are protected here and get to grow up and populate the coral reefs and the oceans. What a beautiful experience to be able to swim through here and be able to photograph all these wonderful examples of life.
people think the Everglades ecosystem ends on land, the flow of water extends far out into the ocean environment, where the influence of land-based activities can be seen on one of America's most beautiful natural resources. As the largest living structures on the planet, coral reefs are among the most biologically diverse and beautiful ecosystems. These massive structures are formed by tiny animals that live in colonies. When they die, their skeletal remains provide a stony building block for the next generation, making these complex formations very ancient. As rainforests of the sea, coral reefs provide millions of people with sources of food, jobs, chemicals, and pharmaceuticals. They also play a generous part in Florida's $13 billion a year tourist industry. And when hurricanes threaten southern Florida, they act as physical barriers to catastrophic storm surges. Follow the path of phosphorus and other pollutants out to the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, where scientists are observing trouble in paradise. At first glance, the environment is stunning. But on closer examination, they find disturbing evidence of a system in decline.
Unfortunately, there is a lot of impacts that are occurring in the Keys. This is really what remains of an elkhorn coral that used to thrive and be the reef builder. As you can see, the actual living coral cover has been replaced by algae, which no longer allows for the coral polyps to recruit and maintain a viable coral reef. Let's take a look at what's going on over here. There's a lot of problems I'd like to show you.
Yeah, people just don't think there's pollution out here because the water's so clear. But the pollution doing the damage is invisible.
There's many natural factors that are affecting coral reefs, and clearly we are part of the problem. This is an example of bleaching, which is related to climate change and increased water temperature on the reef. This is some damage to a fan coral, where you've got some algal growth and you've got some fungal communities here that are starting to attack the corals.
What has happened to this place?
One is climate change. Two is physical damage, and the third is disease, which is oftentimes linked to poor water quality. This is black band disease, which is a blue-green alga that has gone and killed the living coral. That's the white area, the dead coral. Around the edges is the live coral. This is red band disease, similar to black band, but another disease affecting corals in the Keys. Those nutrients are all coming from human activity based on land. They're coming from septic tanks and lawns and road runoff. And they find their way out here to the reef with the currents and the tides.
This looks like filamentous algae, Mark. What's causing it to grow?
In areas near shore, excess nutrients can actually smother a reef with this algal growth and totally kill the corals.
Oh man, it's really sad to see that happening out here.
Mark and Wes have an unusual meeting below the surface of the ocean. They are visiting the National Undersea Research Center Aquarius Habitat. This subsurface laboratory is the underwater equivalent of the International Space Station, hosting scientists for long-term missions to study the plight of coral reefs.
Permission to enter. Okay? Hang on, Mark. Let me show you the front door.
This is an amazing facility. I really wish they had this when I was doing research here in the Keys.
It's also an amazing artificial reef. Look at all the diversity of coral and fish here.
The whole structure is just alive.
Billy Causey is superintendent of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. His job, to help safeguard America's only living coral barrier reef at the southernmost point of the South Florida ecosystem. Aquarius habitat is deployed 3.5 miles offshore at a depth of 60 feet. Scientists live in Aquarius during 10-day missions and use saturation diving to study and explore our coastal ocean. NASA astronauts also utilize the lab to practice techniques for use in space. 5,500 species occupy the 130-mile-long Florida Reef Tract, the third longest barrier reef on the planet. Although Mark and Wes will end their trip here, Jill and Tom follow the water to the Gulf Stream, where it will continue its journey without them.
Really one of those things that's hard to believe that all these areas we've been traveling actually have a connection all the way down here in the Florida Keys.
All the way through the Everglades agricultural area, all the way to Lake Okeechobee, and all the way through the Kissimmee chain of lakes. Every bit of it is connected, and we are downstream. We are at the receiving end of all the water that flows through that vast system.
What's our bearing?
I'm on a northeast heading for the open ocean.
There are many sources of pollution that reach our oceans, and close to half of the pollutants are attributed to stormwater runoff from land. It's a spiral of events. Increasing ocean temperatures are rising above coral survival range. Nutrient runoff allows algae to displace coral on the reef, and destruction of coastal mangroves eliminates places for coral juveniles to hide from predators.
If we lose our coral reefs, we're not only going to lose the most biologically diverse marine ecosystem on the planet, but we're also going to lose something that's very important to the economy of the globe. Protein comes from the ocean. So much of the protein that we eat comes from the ocean. Recreation, commercial activities, but also all the aesthetical values that coral reefs represent. Coral reefs are an indicator ecosystem, and if we lose them, we're going to start losing our oceans. If we lose our oceans, then we'll lose life as we know it today. What we know about this vast ecosystem is that we interrupted it years ago. Congress directed the U.S. Corps of Engineers to get the water out of the Everglades, to make it safe for people, to make it inhabitable for people, make it good for agriculture. We built 1,400 miles of canals that effectively gets rid of the water. 80% of the fresh water that we get every year is lost to tide through those canal systems. And now the natural environment and the built environment are deprived of a lot of fresh water that we need.
So do you have hope in what's going on? Do you think this Everglades restoration plan will make a difference?
I'm very hopeful for the health of and continued health of these coral reefs. Coral reefs have been around for 400 million years, and they're going to outlive us. And we as humans are a part of the ecosystem that affects coral reefs. The more we monitor the change, the more we understand about how they're changing, the more we will be able to adapt our activities to be less injurious to the coral reef or any coastal marine ecosystem.
So Mark, we've really kind of come full circle in your career, haven't we? Yeah, it really is. 14 years ago, I started here in the Keys trying to understand the biology and the ecology of the reef system and understanding nutrient impacts. And as I studied here, I realized that the problem doesn't exist out here in the Keys. The symptoms exist out here. And many of the problems originate on land. And I really wanted to understand how to try to solve those problems. And so I've really been working my way upstream or up the watershed ever since, trying to figure out how do we actually deal with the sources of the contaminants and the pollutants and the hydrology that we really need to get right to protect things like the Florida Keys.
Okay, we're about 6 miles offshore now. There's about 600 feet of water below us.
Boy, I always get a funny feeling in my stomach when I know there's that much water underneath me.
Well, the current's picking up, so we're into the Gulf Stream.
Well, this is kerosene dye. As scientists, we use this stuff to track the flow of water through hydrologic systems.
Wow, it looks like a nebula.
Yeah, the stuff is very visual. It's going to allow us to actually see the movement of water.
You know, when you see this drifting off north, you can't deny that what we do on land ends up in the ocean, and once it's in the ocean, it's set loose on the world.
This dye is really going places. We're in the Gulf Stream, which is the largest river on Earth.
As it moves up the coast of the Americas, it's going to hit places like Scotland.
Well, Jill, our journey is over. But the water is still continuing on. Its journey never ends.
To purchase this episode of Water's Journey, Everglades, Currents of Change, call 1-888-354-2376.
Okay, so next week we're going to be looking into the ocean itself, the pelagics, which is where it gets deep, and that'll be fun. And then, so just do one chapter and have a Jesus-filled week.